So I turn off my video. So.
Well, you don't have to turn off your video. I will edit it out anyway.
Okay.
It's actually good if you have your video, then we can see what you're saying.
With great
or
pleasure.
if it's really you or if it's an avatar. All right. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for joining us in our presentation about what we've been doing in the sprint for this term, sprint 3. And the focus today is stakeholder mapping, but we also want to give you some background to the research. For those of you who haven't met us, I'm Dina and I reside at the informatics division. So does Nataliya. And we're both interested in change processes and communication issues. And it's very nice to be able to bring in our perspectives into the metrics track. So in general terms then, our research is really about how to enable effective communication in agile software organizations. And the first step in trying to achieve this has been to try to explore a bit how the communication challenges in metrics team and stakeholders context. And that has yielded some interesting findings. And we are now at the stage where we ended up with stakeholder mapping. But if we just briefly go through the findings of the first sprints. So this is the overall vision. And it's quite important because the thing about soft skills and the thing about communication is that it's really central to what software development teams are doing. And it's central to performance across the organization because it affects both how well the process and delivery goes, but it also affects relationships and trust. So we can move on. So if we cut through the chase, this image here really presents the overall findings and ways to address these communication challenges that we have found in this metrics stakeholder communication context. And in a way you can look at it, how to create a better communication environment. You can see here we have things relating to what metrics are we supposed to be doing? You need to define the purpose. We need to clarify the roles within the teams. We need to cultivate the metrics culture. We need to celebrate the wins across the process. So if we just distill the main themes in this, what we have landed in terms of the challenges, they are then related to things like how do we align expectations? How can we prioritize demands across the project? How do we as a metric teams prioritize stakeholder demands? How can we find ways to better feedback on what is going on, how metrics are being used to improve the final outcomes? And how can we find ways to have this continuous dialogue? And I think, so these are sort of enduring questions. And in a way, what we're trying to do is trying to operationalize. I mean, it's easy to talk about communication, but what does it actually mean to improve communication? Because everyone can nod and say, yes, it's important. So in a sense, then, the conclusion from this is that we have found that stakeholders are really, really important in the process of developing, designing and delivering metrics. And they're as important as actually what goes on within the metrics team. And the other issue is that because it's a complex social environment, because we have so many project stakeholders, and sometimes we don't always know what the stakeholders are, understanding this is important because it links to how we manage expectations. We need to know what expectations people have, what are the clear ones, and what are the unsaid expectations. So all of these dynamics really affect how we work together and what comes out at the other end. So landing with that, we realized together with the two participating organizations, Ericsson and Axis, that there is a need to understand who are the stakeholders. And that led us to develop initial research on stakeholder mapping. And this is what we're going to tell more, the initial findings, what comes out of this. And for those of you who are interested to know more about what the previous sprints has yielded in terms of insights, feel free to access our previous presentations at the Software Center website. So I'm handing over to Nataliya.
Thank you, Dina. Can you hear me? Okay, so it's a good question. Who are our stakeholders and what do they want? It's kind of amazing that during the first and second sprint, we were working very hard on analyzing communication between metrics teams and stakeholders. But at the end of the second sprint, we realized that it was not completely clear for team members who are our stakeholders. And it's essential to understand who our stakeholders are in order to understand how to communicate with them in the best possible way. So this is a good question. And I'm not sure in the audience how many of you are working with metrics. Maybe some of you are not working with metrics, but with other things. But I'm pretty sure that many of you work with stakeholders, and some of you might recognize some of the challenges that the metrics team in this sprint experienced and is experiencing. And I hope that in this presentation can kind of inspire you if you need to do stakeholder analysis, stakeholder mapping. This is a kind of suggestion that can be used for any team. So this is what we have done in Sprint 3, stakeholder mapping. Why is it important? Identifying stakeholders and understanding their needs is essential, actually, in order to develop, appropriate communication strategies to align expectations and actually deliver what the stakeholders want. And if you read, different papers in this area about stakeholders, there is plenty of literature. And in theory, it looks really simple. Okay, a stakeholder is a person who has a mandate and resources to act upon the status of the indicators provided by the measurement systems, which is an example of a definition. And there are plenty of definitions of stakeholders, plenty of papers. But when we met the metrics team, we realized that in practice, there are so many different stakeholders. Some of them are like primary kind of stakeholders. Some are not really primary stakeholders. So in practice, it's so difficult actually to identify the stakeholders who sometimes have conflicting goals, conflicting priorities, and it's really challenging to handle them. And it's especially challenging for new teams. If you are a newly formed team, as for example, the metrics team we met in this sprint, it can be especially challenging kind of to realize, to identify the stakeholders in order to prioritize the work. And it's not only important for productivity, but it's also important for both teams and stakeholders' well-being. So that's why we had a great pleasure actually trying this mapping, doing this mapping during the sprint. I can also say that there are plenty of different models and plenty of different tools in this area about stakeholder identification from different fields. But the research on stakeholder mapping in agile software development organizations is still in its infancy. So many models in the area of stakeholder mapping are quite rigid. They think, okay, you just categorize stakeholders according to power, influence, whether they're external or internal. Seems reasonable, but if you have an agile working environment when people have multiple roles and the tempo is quite fast, so it becomes kind of more complicated that many of those studies currently show. So it's kind of interesting perspective that we got from this sprint, that it's more complicated than many researchers think it is. It's also, I would say, a key, what to say, soft skill, that it's not so easy to identify stakeholders in practice. It's very important for project management, absolutely, but how can we identify stakeholders? How can we retrieve this information from the teams, from stakeholders, potential stakeholders in the organizational context? So it really requires both intuition and also some kind of, I would say, capacity for analysis, some kind of strategy. And we have gone through a number of papers in this area, and we tried to find out, okay, what are the models that can be potentially applied for metrics team in agile organizations. And we're going to present a suggestion. Maybe it can be useful for some of you who have similar challenges with identification of stakeholders. The methods we used the framework was stakeholder circle analysis. It means that you analyze stakeholders in 5 main steps, and we are going today to talk about 3 first steps: is identification, prioritization, and visualization. It means that the first step, what you do is actually you talk to people and ask them to identify the stakeholders. What are your primary stakeholders? Then you try to talk how to prioritize them. And at this point, it's also important to think that priorities, it's not always easy to define them, to to say, okay, maybe this stakeholder is prioritized in this context, but not really prioritized in that context. So, and also you should suggest to focus on proximity, how close the stakeholder is to your team, both geographically, but in terms of interests. And urgency, for example, how do you prioritize stakeholders in terms of urgency? Are there stakeholders which requests are more urgent to handle than other stakeholders? How do you handle those priorities? And visualization, it's also important. It's quite, in many cases, it's quite difficult for people to create this picture. Okay, who are our stakeholders? But due to the complexity, due to multiple roles. So visualization aspect, it's also quite important to have a kind of mind map, this picture of the stakeholders and their expectations and their needs, which is quite essential if you try to create a communication plan, for example, for stakeholder team communication. It's also important, how can we communicate with stakeholders in the best possible way? Then we need to have a good picture who the stakeholders are and their expectations. So in this sprint, and here we would like to thank Ulla, who helped us enormously with getting a chance to meet metrics team in Axis. It's a relatively new team, but they worked together for like 2 years, something. And we had a great pleasure conducting 2 interactive online workshops, which were based using the stakeholder circle methodology, and they were based also on the analysis of data from sprint 1 and 2. During sprint 1 and 2, we identified a number of challenges with stakeholders and a number of stakeholders they meet. So we use this information to plan our workshops. And we also adapted stakeholder circle analysis to metrics team context. So the workshops had 2 parts. The first one, we openly discussed who are our stakeholders. Not only the stakeholders that they meet at this point, but also the prospective stakeholders, the stakeholders they would like to have, the stakeholders they would like to develop relationship with. It's also important for, especially for new team, to see the perspective. Okay, where are we going? What do we have now, and what are we going to? And second, we had stakeholder expectations mapping, that we used the mind map that was based on the data from interviews from the previous sprints. and they were developed in collaboration with industry collaborators. Here we can mention Wilhelm, Ola, and Miroslav, who helped enormously to provide basic ideas and planning for the mind map. We showed in the mind map the focus on information quality, information products, priorities, and team access. These were the issues that were mentioned in relation to communication with stakeholders. Expectations concerning what information quality they would like to, they expect, what information products they expect, what priorities they have, what's called assignment handling, and team access. How do they plan to access the team? How do they make contacts with the team? And here is our mind map. There are plenty of different great examples, great software in this field. This is an example that when you would like to retrieve information from people and ask them, okay, what are the expectations? You cannot just ask open question online. People would become confused. So this mind map helped us together with the team to fill it in. Okay, what are the priorities? What kind of priorities in relation to different stakeholders you can observe, and so on. So this is how we worked, and this is, I would say that if in your organization, if you need to do stakeholder mapping, you can just change, okay, what are the expectations that you would like to focus on? Ask yourself this question and think, okay, what mind map I can create, and ask team members to fill in. So the results. We actually realized more and more that it's a very challenging area, identification of stakeholders for the metric team. Why? First of all, a relatively limited knowledge of metrics and metrics team in the organization. There were some metrics team members that like, well, if the stakeholders are not sure what we are doing, it's difficult for them to kind of even think that they are our stakeholders. They are not aware of it at all, but even for us kind of to meet their expectations, because they don't know so much about what we can deliver. And also the metrics team is a cross-functional team that makes stakeholders from different parts of organization. And you can see here, these are the examples. They mentioned project managers, developers, architects, product owners, management, and as they say, a broad and undefined category, saying, okay, many people come to us. And of course, it's a challenge in terms of, okay, how to plan your work, how to prioritize, how to define, this is my area, this is not my area. This is where my responsibility ends and where it starts. So, and this is the field in mind map that is a result, one of the results from the workshop, that together we created it with the team members, showing, okay, these are the issues in relation to stakeholders' expectations. For example, assignment handling that we handle them, for example, using Kanban boards, for example, using informal dialogues, and so on. I'm not going to go into details, but I will mention just a couple of kind of important, interesting things about each one. The first one is expectations about information quality. That all team members agreed that there are differences in expectations concerning transparency. And again, this is something that is relevant to any organization. Okay, how transparent you are when you deliver your results, what expectations about transparency your stakeholders have in any organization. It's a quite important question. For example, the differences, for example, concerning transparency and methods used to gather metrics, how data is handled, how information products are developed. Some, for example, considered project managers and product owners to be like have moderate level of transparency, but others maybe, for example, developers can consider it's more important to ask more questions. Or of course, if you know the expectations concerning transparency, you can be ready to answer those questions, and it helps enormously to save time and to plan your work and your priorities. Second, expectation about information products. For some categories of stakeholders, it was quite clear, oh, these are the products. For example, architects expect often feature dashboards. But for other stakeholders categories, it was more difficult because, again, they have a kind of limited understanding what it means to be matrix team stakeholder. So the spectrum of requests can be quite broad if you come to these stakeholder categories. It means that it takes longer time to understand the requests and, of course, to meet the expectations. And, of course, if you think about planning of your communication with stakeholders, then you maybe should think, okay, maybe I should prepare to communicate with this stakeholder kind in a different way than, for example, I prepare for communication with architects. So, and sometimes they can also have complex and conflicting requests. That is also a challenge. Then about priorities. Prioritizing, again, is a challenge in any organization for many teams, for all of us, I would say, in any context. But here in this example, this matrix team, it was one of the challenges was actually not to prioritize matrix stakeholders, but prioritize management requests, management priorities, and other stakeholders. And in some cases, it was quite frustrating because the team had to follow roadmaps, which the team considered they were kind of imposed on them, that they had to deliver, to prioritize following those roadmaps. And sometimes those roadmaps collided with other stakeholders' requests. So in this case, it was like, okay, how can we handle that? That management expectations, management's priorities, and our, I would say, primary stakeholders' priorities, they collide, and it created quite much confusion and stress. Here we can talk about self-organizing teams and agile environment. You can also question how this kind of roadmaps should be applied for this kind of work. And finally, expectations about team access. We all today use multiple communication channels. And matrix team members said that basically stakeholders, they use all different ways of accessing the team. It's email, you have telephone calls and all other things. However, there is also, and it was not only mentioned in Axis, but in other organizations we looked at, that there is a somewhat lack of consistency in using those communication channels. So it means that one stakeholder can become prioritized by just coming to the team and asking, now I need you to do this task, and ignore that one. And it also created stress for the team because they had to switch from one task to another. And it also resulted that some stakeholders felt that they were treated unfairly. And this fairness aspect, if you look at stakeholder literature, it's very important that stakeholders feel that they're treated fairly in relation to prioritization. So this is something that can really damage team stakeholder relationship, which is worth looking at. So all from me, Dina. Cannot hear you. Yes, I can hear.
Right, do you want me to run through this or do you want to continue? I mean, I just love hearing your voice at this point, so I don't want you to stop.
I can continue. I can say, just to sum up what I mentioned, is that it is quite complicated to identify stakeholders and expectations if you have a new team. But as strongly as a communication expert, of course I work with informatics, but okay, communication expert, I can say that it's very valuable, important step to do when you have a new team, to help people to kind of make it clear, create with someone like us, outsiders, create a picture of who our stakeholders are and what do they want from us, because it helps actually to realize how to plan their work. And of course, in case of metrics, which seems to be for them, it's still quite new, though it's 2 years, over 2 years. Limited knowledge additionally complicates identification of stakeholders. So we need to learn more about metrics, the metrics role in organizations. So it's not only the issue for metrics team to handle or for stakeholders to handle. It's on organizational level, need to learn people what is the point of having metrics. And also this with competing demands is something that everyone meets, but here especially challenging if you are a new team. So you need support here. And of course, this with communication channels should be considered and handled. But it's easier to say than to do. But we hope at least that
Nataliya, I think you muted yourself.
Yeah, I'm muted because I changed the slide and it mutes automatically. Yeah, thank you. Next sprint.
Okay. So thank you, Nataliya. I just realized now when you present, it's quite a lot of stuff that comes out of this, and we are slowly building up the knowledge within the area of how to enable more effective communication. And I hope it really becomes clear on that there are many issues here, but there are things that you can actually do to get started. So in the next sprint, we're hoping to implement what we call micro interventions. And that's like some sort of action research to test out together with the participating companies. We can do more. We were thinking of getting into the next stage of engaging and monitoring in the stakeholder mapping methodology to see, can we make a difference? How can we modify this? So this is an important part of the next sprint. And then it's the possibility of actually including more organizations. So in a way, we're working agile, we're iterating the process. And it would be nice to hear if you have any ideas or if you have any feedback on this. Nataliya, I can add if there is anything else regarding this way of working that I have missed to cover.
I think Nataliya is still muted.
This is the first. I just gets muted all the time. It's the first step, but what we need to do right now is, okay, we know more or less the stakeholders. Then we can actually provide some guidelines and ask people to test them and practice. And we really hope that in autumn we will be able to come to Axis and actually involve people in action research, that they can get a better awareness of their communication with the stakeholders and actually see whether those guidelines can help them to improve communication. That's what it means here, engage and monitor, see whether there are changes over time in communication. And we might, for example, consider using stakeholder engagement profile as another method to help people to find the strategies that can help them to communicate. Yeah, these are our references. And if you need any information, feel free to drop us a line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Then I stop recording.